The following is a presentation of Tuning into Sci-Fi TV, the viewer's guide to genre television.
So welcome everyone to a special Google Hangout between the Tuning into Sci-Fi Small Council, and today we're talking with the Game of Thrones Academy. So I want to go around and have everyone introduce themselves. We'll start with the Academy guys.
Hi, I'm Gil from Game of Thrones Academy.
Hi, I'm Itamar from Game of Thrones Academy. No title.
And I am Jesse Jackson, Master of the Fanboy, because I'm going to be gooing and awing over our guests.
Oh.
And I am Christine from Michigan, the Mistress of Correction and Consistency, although I think today I won't be the one doing the corrections. I think that will be the Academy boys.
Yes.
And I am Wendy. I am the Mistress of Schedules, Moderation, and Questions for today. So welcome everyone for a lot of fun, I think, talking about history and Game of Thrones. And for folks who aren't familiar already with the Game of Thrones Academy videos and our hosts, tell us a little bit about your background with Game of Thrones. Were you a reader right from the start, or how did you sort of find them, and what really attracts you to this whole world that George R.R. Martin's created?
First of all, I would like to thank you for having us on your show. We loved your podcast, so thank you, and we're very excited to do it.
Yeah, thank you.
So Itamar, tell them about your own experience.
My engagement with the books, I started with the books about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, before there was a TV show. It was like an accident. I found, my brother found the Clash of Kings and Storm of Swords in a coffee shop. Someone left it there. And I started reading it, and we're not such a big fantasy fans. And he said to me after a few days, listen, it's not a fantasy you think it is. It's something else. And after he finished it, I read it, and I couldn't. I started reading it, and I couldn't put it out of my arms, and I became a fan. And then came the show, like after a few years.
No, but you read the first book was the last book that you read.
Yeah, I started with Clash of Kings.
Uh-huh.
I read all the stuff in Game of Thrones on the Wikipedia because to feel the voice. So I didn't have got the pain from Ned Stark's death.
Oh.
It was like, okay, this guy called Ned probably dead.
That is a weird place to start.
Very weird. Actually, I started with the show. And after the third season, I read the first book, and after the fourth season this past year, I read all of them. And we started to talk about it every day. Like I would update them. Okay, so I'm at this part, and then we discuss it politically and historically.
And all that time, I said, I have this theory. Just read the books. I want to tell you about my theory. I have this theory.
He did spoil some of the books.
Really?
You did.
Sorry. Sorry.
That's okay, right?
That's a hazard with book readers.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
That's funny because Shannon and Lou are more of the people who've read more of the books. Christine, I think you've read a couple too, right?
Yeah, I'm actually somewhere in the middle of book 3. I had to put it down for a long time. School started.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because I think the book readers walk a fine line of telling too much, spoiling too much inadvertently, but I also similarly I didn't read the books before the show, and then I listened to book 1 on books on tape, and it was useful to go back, but honestly I don't know if I would have kept reading after book 1 if I didn't know there was more coming or had to wait as long as the book readers did. So good on you. I love that you didn't read the first book because so many people connect with Ned as their Hook and the Stark. So you're probably not all that Team Stark either by not starting with book 1.
You hate Casey.
I got my my pain from Rob's death.
Yes.
Put it aside, and I said, no, it can't happen. It's not real. So I had the pain. I felt the cruelty of George R. R. Martin, but with his son, with Ned's son, not with his son. I'm not Tim Stark. I'm more like individual person.
I'm Team George Harman.
Yeah, I want the story to be good. I'm not a fan of this book.
One of the things that I find really interesting is, myself and I think most of our small council, we're very Western-centric. We live in the U.S. or Canada, and even in school, we're mostly focused in our history focused on Western European history. But Game of Thrones seems very focused that way, at least in the beginning of the books. But it has this really broad global appeal, and I'm curious because you guys are in Israel, what your insight is into that global appeal.
Okay, I have a theory. Itamar has another. My theory is basically the whole stories of the Middle Ages, the knights and the princesses and the kings and whatever. That has become pretty much part of the global culture because European culture has spread out throughout. But then George R. R. Martin, he does something unique that he looks at this pre-modern era of the honorable knights and the valiant kings in a postmodern way. So they become like real people, real politicians. They are not heroes. So I think that's an interesting take to go back to an era that was supposed to be simpler and look at it in a complex way. That's my take on it.
Yeah. I have a more prosaic theory. I think in '99, I think the Lord of the Rings, the first movie came out, and then it started like a trend, and Harry Potter was very popular around the world. I think the people back then, when they were like, let's say 10 or 12, now they're in their 20s and 30s. So they got their background with fantasy, and now they're adults, so they want to get like a bold fantasy. And I think like if the series were to come like 30 years ago, it would be maybe a tenth of the audience because it was more like a niche, like the fantasy niche and the sci-fi niche back then. But now it's like mainstream. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter made it mainstream, and Game of Thrones made it for adults, like real characters and not good versus evil, and with sex and blood and real consequences. So I think this is the appeal to the mainstream today.
You know, that's a really interesting take. I've certainly thought of the Lord of the Rings part, but I've never did the Harry Potter connection. That gave, kind of set the groundwork, tilled the soil, so to speak, so that you would be able to enjoy Game of Thrones. That's a pretty interesting thought. That's why we like the videos. Good thing.
Interesting guy.
The other thing I was thinking about as you were talking was two things. One, the Shakespearean tradition of history. So the idea that you took these real concepts of knights, and then we've almost created a mythology through Western European literature. So he's kind of continuing in that vein to some extent. But to your point, he took Lord of the Rings and said, well, let's not make it so perfect, and always everything works out for the best. I kind of think it's almost like Arthurian, bringing some of the Arthurian legend into the Lord of the Rings, sort of. Because there was lots of scandal and political intrigue in certain varieties of Arthurian legend. But I really like the idea of thinking about this as an evolution for audiences, because the Lord of the Rings did establish the sort of epic storytelling and people joining forces who maybe didn't always trust each other and had some bad history with each other. But then the idea that Harry Potter and the fantasy element of Harry Potter, the magic part, because Harry Potter's pretty dark, even though it's a story for young adults. I mean, Harry goes through some really dark times, so that's interesting that that's a gateway to Game of Thrones. I like that thought a lot.
It's a gateway in terms of breaking to the mainstream, into the mainstream, because fantasy was always popular. When I was younger, I read fantasy, like the Tolkien imitators, George R. R. Martin likes to call them. But it was like a niche. It wasn't wasn't that popular. It wasn't in the mainstream. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't a global, widespread phenomenon with memes and like politicians talking about it and celebrities talking about it.
Yeah, it wasn't taken very seriously.
No.
I mean, it's very hard for a fantasy or a science fiction movie or show to really get a lot of awards outside of, visual effects. But nowadays, that's changed.
Yeah, when I can remember when the show was first announced, I had not read the books. I still haven't read the books. And you were going, well, it's HBO, so it'll be good. But, Wendy and I both were fans of Rome, and that didn't catch on to, popular culture. So you're like, in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, hopefully it'll be something good. But it'll probably be a one and done. It certainly won't be like Sopranos or The Wire or something like that. And then all of a sudden, it happens and it keeps growing. And I think it's a couple things, right? It is the culture's ready for it, and two, they execute really well. This is a well-told story with great acting, and it keeps surprising you. And especially as someone who hadn't read the books, there are the WTF moments all the time where you go, no, they can't do that, and they do.
Yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones just won the most Emmy Awards for a single season for a show, including Best Drama, including Best Writing. Peter Dinklage won for acting. There was a lot of the technical awards as well. But, it's nice to see that a show that is embraced by a large audience is also acknowledged to be a really good show, and it's not just, oh, the masses are just enjoying their popcorn. It's a legitimately deserved, awards for the complexity of the story, the acting, the whole production. It's well deserved. Although I think it's interesting, it comes at season 5, which is probably one of the most divisive, and where they're starting to deviate more from the source, and that's starting to create a lot of tension in the fandom, I think, too.
And how we've had, this is the year where we had the Sansa storyline that was so controversial, and and there's others that just think it's horrible, and then there's the people that go, have you not been watching the show? I mean, nothing good happens to this show. So and it's also not only entertaining us, but it's spurring a debate, which is what great drama does.
Right. Definitely.
I want to come back to history for a minute there because, George R. R. Martin talks about his inspirations, and I want to hear you guys talk about that in the context of the primary historical events. But, that's the argument for why the show retains so much sexism, misogyny, violence. The argument is, well, it's reflective of the period that inspired it. And I'm curious how much you agree or disagree with the idea that you have to, he's obviously committed to that in his writing, he's going to carry it through. Is that even a legitimate argument to you, that people can question that once the author's made the choice, that's the choice? Is there a valid critique even to question it?
I think in the books there are not many people who attack George R. R. Martin for being sexist or for writing sexist plot lines, even though the violence there against women is harsher than it is on the show, because you can't show some of the stuff that you read, you imagine it, but if you will watch it, it will be too much to bear.
Yeah.
So I feel personally that the showrunners, their defense is, I don't know, it's like a blanket defense for everything. This happens in this world, it could happen, so if you write it in the story, then it's fine. I don't know, I think you can discuss specific plot lines and mention why they could be different, and actually they were different. Why, you can ask them, why did you change it from one thing to another? I think that's a legitimate critique of the show. And if you defend yourself generally saying this is something that happens in the world or in this world, I don't know, it wasn't very convincing for me, at least.
Talking about specific about Sansa.
About Sansa, and I don't know, about Arya, her scene where she was abused, like the pedophile, this night. I didn't like it. I didn't like it.
And you didn't like it because of the deviation from the books, or because of the way they actually depicted it?
I think it was too much. Like Itamar says, they fell in love with the shock value. I didn't feel it had much purpose. I didn't feel it had any purpose. It didn't serve any purpose in the story. Okay, we got it. He's an evil bastard, whatever. So you don't have to show us again and again how he's beating up one girl and then another girl and then another. It was too much. And there were many similar instances this past season. As they started to write their own story and their own interpretation of the original story, I don't know. That bothered me. Frankly, that bothered me.
I think of back on Battlestar Galactica, Ron Moore did a podcast after episodes, and he would discuss the show. And he would mention sometimes, we got criticism that we did blank. And he would say, I think that's a fair complaint. This is the decision we made, but now looking back, and I've gotten this feedback, I don't know if we would still have done it. I stand by, that's the decision we made, but we were trying to tell a story. And so I totally agree with you guys, just to say, well, it's the Middle Ages and we have to do this. Well, no, you make changes all the time. So if I would have preferred him going, we thought this was important to show what a SOB this guy was, and if we went over, we're sorry, but that was what we were trying to do. Instead of just, and I agree with you, it's doing, to mix by metaphors, a Star Trek shield up, like, oh, you can't touch us, versus, let's discuss this, because we're treating it with the respect. This isn't a popcorn drama. This is something that you are trying to talk about true emotions. You're having a discussion about how it's related to history. And so do us watchers and readers the courtesy of, you may not agree with our feedback, but you should acknowledge that we have a viewpoint.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
I have a slightly different take on the whole situation. I know that what happened to Sansa bugged a lot of people, but it happened in the book just not to Sansa. It happened to a character that we barely know, and we don't really care that much about. But it did happen. In fact, from what I've heard, it was much worse in the book. But it wasn't Sansa. Now, when we're dealing with a TV show that a lot of the audience already has a lot of trouble keeping track of all the characters, what they did was basically take a character that we know, that we care about, and put them in that role. So they didn't change the events, they just changed the players, at least with the Sansa role. And yeah, it's horrible, but apparently they did make it better. It wasn't as bad, and they didn't even literally show it to us. We only knew it was happening and saw the horror of somebody else having to watch it. I think they did really pull it back. They didn't hit us with the shock value that they could have, that was presented in the book. And I think just the form of media, the fact that we're looking at it instead of just imagining it, makes it seem worse to us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think I agree that they made a choice, and you know, I don't disagree with the idea of giving a storyline to Sansa that wasn't in the books. I mean, as a book reader, I'm not as invested in that character. So I can totally see where if you're a book reader first, you've been tracking the arc of this character, and now the show puts them on a completely different track. And it may turn out in the end that she's going to end up in the same place. And they wanted to service not just her character, but the Ramsay Bolton storyline as well. And that was sort of the idea they came up with to do it. But I do think that there's an ongoing criticism about violence towards women in the show. And at a certain point, you've established the rules in this universe, so I don't have to keep seeing the rules over and over again. I just know that they're happening, and it can happen off screen, it can happen through dialogue. It doesn't have to be, you know, torture porn, for lack of a better description.
But then again, I've seen with many other shows that when they don't show something, when they simply tell us something that has happened, it doesn't stick with the viewers as well.
No, I agree, and they're walking a fine line for sure.
I would say,
don't tell it.
In the books, this character Jane Poole, her rape and whatever, it was actually off screen. But I would say that the showrunners, they are very happy when people are really engaged in the show, when it's something positive. For example, the Red Wedding, like we saw. Thousands of people die throughout the first 3 seasons, and we didn't care all that much. But when it happened to Rob and to Caitlin and to Talisa, everybody got really, really emotional, and we were very, very invested. But now, the same investment now comes in a negative way, and now they say, you just care about it because it's somebody you care about. Okay, but those are the rules of the game of any story, if it's a book or a movie or a show, and also you can't have it both ways. If you like it that people are emotionally invested, sometimes it could be in a way that you did not expect it.
Yeah, there's going to be a backlash.
Yeah, I totally agree, and you know, and I think, to go back to you, my only point would be to kind of own the criticism a little more than just pushing it away, and you know, and I certainly don't think they should do the show based on fan input, because then it will be a horrible show.
Because then we get heroes again.
Yeah, and there's no one view of fandom, right, that has the idea. You tell the story you want to do, and you go with it, and you hope that, you know, people get it and like it, and yeah, I know this was a controversial season in a lot of ways, but I was very proud as a Game of Thrones fan to see them win the Emmy. You know, I was like, all right, this is kind of nice and to see. So, yeah.
So now I want to switch back to history a little bit and talk about the Middle Ages, because hopefully more than just the folks who normally listen to our small council discussion will be watching our Google Hangout. So I want to talk and get our Academy guests to talk about the late Middle Ages and sort of the key aspects of the historical events, but also the mindset of the Middle Ages that's influencing the story?
What's the question?
What are the historical events from the Middle Ages that are most influencing the story? And beyond events, what are some of the attributes, the mindset in the Middle Ages that's also informing the story?
Yeah, it's a great. I think indeed George R. R. Martin said it himself. The event called the War of the Roses, an event in the late 15th century in Britain, like a big civil war with powerful houses, which its consequences changed the history of Britain and the world, subsequently. And I think the main theme in the story that relates to the current period, like the late Middle Ages, it's the absence of a central power and loyalty not towards an ideology or like a symbol as a state or something like that, but loyalty to the village, loyalty to the local, loyalty to the Lord, and vice versa. Like if I'm a peasant, I'm loyal to my lord. If I'm a lord, I'm loyal to my lord, etc. There's no like a central power and a central idea that in institutions that like controls the big population, and that is the main thing of the Middle Ages. Like the Middle Ages, I'm hyperbolic, but it's like every year you have the Super Bowl. So in the Middle Ages, you have like every year a war between someone, this house and that house, because there weren't like any central power that had the power and become a mediator between all the ambitions, and that's one thing. Another thing, you have the contrast of that, which is the free cities. In the story and in the Middle Ages, it's something like not the opposite, but a very, very different and very uncommon. In the Middle Ages, is a urban society, and when we look at the cities from back then, which we see much more in common, we have much more in common today as an urban culture and urban society in the Western world today with those free cities, and he incorporated these Italian free cities in his book. And I think like this inspiration of the Italian free cities and the urban culture and capitalism later on, I hope at least it will become like a major theme in the conclusion of the story.
Well, one of the things as you were talking I was thinking about is how disproportionate individuals' impact is in the Middle Ages, right? So it's just the decision making of the guys at the top that are having a massive impact on everybody, and these decisions are made for their own personal gain, but also sometimes just pure vengeance too. So it's it reminds me, all politics is personal and local, which is what's happening, right? So if Robb had been more persuasive, he might have been able to keep his bannermen all together. If Jon Snow had been able to understand all the other Night's Watch, he might have been able to persuade them over to why his ideas were what they needed to do, despite how offensive they were to the Night's Watch, who viewed the wildlings as their enemies. So for the free cities, why would they get involved is my question, right? I'm Bravos. I'm the Bank of Bravos. Things are great, right? I got trade. I mean, at what level of disruption has to happen in Westeros to persuade me to get in the game?
I don't think necessarily as like a game between Bravos as a free city and Westeros as a feudal system, but ideas, they're like water sometimes, they cross over, and the only thing separates between the Westeros and the free cities is like a small channel, and when things are getting bad, and there's a shift in society and culture because of some kind of catastrophe, this is a good ground for new ideas to hold and to prosper.
Right.
And it seems to me that like the societies in the free cities are much more calculated in their politics, in the way they arrange their relationship between one another, than Westeros, which is basically loyalty, tradition, and power.
But also, I would add that we see not only in Westeros there's a war. There's a war coming to Essos, probably with the Dothraki. Maybe something would go on over there that would push some people over from Essos to Westeros, or I don't know, lead to change. That's just like we see today with the migrants going over to Europe.
Right.
Do something in one point, in one place, and then it has a totally different impact 100 years later.
Also, wars are very profitable, and they're a bank.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
But you think that they might sort of, to Christine's point, lend money but with conditions. So it'll be like you need to start making reform in King's Landing or Westeros. You need to start adopting some ideas too. Would they put those conditions on, or just interest on their own?
I really don't know. I don't know. It could be. It could be. It seems plausible. It seems plausible that it introduced us to me as a reader. It introduced me this whole new world of politics. How you do stuff in a fantasy world, in a mid-level world. It seems to me that you won't leave it only across the channel. Some of it will fall in Westeros or come to Westeros in some way, in that way or another. I don't know. Maybe like the chaos in Essos will bring a lot of migrants to Westeros from the free cities, and or wildlings, they are coming from the north to the south with totally different way of thinking of things. And you will have to accommodate them somehow. And the way you accommodate them, it will be a rearrangement of the political order. It won't be like you snap your hand, okay, freedom and social mobility and capitalism for all. But the roots of the roots of this more free world and more a world that's more similar to our world, I see the roots like growing now because of the crisis, because of the catastrophe that is coming.
So I had a question. You're talking to politics. So as we watch this show, at least from my perspective, I am cheering for. I am hoping the character that I like, wins this Game of Thrones, which is not necessarily the person who is the best leader and who will it be, which I think of in modern politics, especially in the U.S., I can't speak to the others, that in a lot of ways we don't choose the person who would be the best president. We choose the person that campaigns the best or is the best, charismatic thing. So from a historical perspective, did that work in that way? Was it the most powerful leader, or was it the most charismatic leader? That when you're having this upheaval, when you are changing from your rulers, not from a dynasty, but so I hope I'm making sense on my question.
No, it's a great question, and I'm sorry to to say that it was always like that.
Okay.
Of course, if you live in a society which the Game of Thrones there, like the politics is based on your blood, so you can be like mute and you'll still be king because it doesn't matter. You're the son of a king and you're the firstborn, so you'll be king. But in like more open societies like the Roman civilization and the Greek civilization, the power of the words and the rhetoric and demagoguery was basically the same as today. You could have a lot of power because you know how to talk. You have the gift of gab, and a lot of the criticism towards democracy that we have in our hands from that period of time, like 2,000 years ago, from 2,500 years ago, is because of that a charismatic person can come and use his tongue to convince everyone to do stupid stuff or horrible stuff that is bad for the state. So it's not a new problem. Because of the media today, it's much more big and it comes to our doorstep. But it's not a big change in that sense.
So, unfortunately, there just isn't a way to ensure that the person who is the best ruler is the one who gets to rule. I mean, there isn't a test we can have them take.
Yeah, and I think as a viewer, I find myself torn between that you know, I love Jon Snow. I really think that the character has kind of come into his own, and I was thrilled when he was made, you know, head of the Night Watch. But he was, as Wendy talked about, he wasn't a very good politician. He was so focused on the ideal that he said, okay, I don't want to build a kind of consensus where we can work together. And so I don't know if Dany will be a good king because I think she has the right ideas, but can she execute well? And so it's interesting to see that we get wrapped up into that character, but not necessarily just because we like them doesn't mean they should be the ruler.
Jesse, you've just described every issue I have with voting on politicians. Like, I like this person, but honestly, I don't know if their ideas are the right ones or if their ideas are going to pan out in the end. The problem is probably most people don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe the whole premise, which is the people who want to rule come forward versus ruling is a duty and a responsibility. So it's an entirely different process. You don't actually get to raise your hand to do it. You get selected to do it because you're qualified versus claiming you're qualified and then finding out later that you really weren't. And because when you think about it, in any time period, certainly today, you know, why would you want to be in charge of these things? I mean, seriously, there's got to be some major issues that you're trying to work through if you want to run any country today.
And we wouldn't want the people who want to be in charge. Those are the same people that we wouldn't want them to be in charge. Exactly. Like in we have made a habit to elect like the worst people.
Yeah, but it's like the problem with democracy. I love democracy, but
sure.
One of the problems with democracy is like the politicians that want to get elected. They're trying to convince us they're normal, but we as voters, we don't really want a normal person. We want an extraordinary person that will rule, not a normal person. So it's like we have a dilemma. They're trying to convince us they're normal, but we don't want no normal. Want the exception.
Yeah, I think I think Penn Jillette on his podcast talked about it. You know, when did we decide we wanted just a regular guy to be president? We want an intellectual. We want someone that's better than us trying to lead, and it's interesting. So, and that's the same thing when we go back to the show, right? You want someone who's a good leader. And I don't know if we have a good leader right now in the remaining players in the show. What do you guys think?
I think we have. I think there is a leader and there is like the manager. Both of the stuff both of the characteristics are good to rule and are important. The leader needs to look to the horizon and say, I want to go there. The manager needs to execute it. And I think George R. R. Martin has told, or I got from the Clash of Kings, from the Tyrion chapter, that George R. R. Martin said, like really hinted that Tyrion is a very good manager. Not necessarily a leader that looks to the future and says, let's follow me. The very good manager, very skilled, player in the game, and John is like a leader that looks at the end game, looks at the real enemy, and says, "Follow me. This is the right direction." But he's a bad player. So the question needs to be, what does Westeros need now? This perspective change in leader, or like a good manager that will make the deals and prevent civil war?
I think a good manager.
Yeah, I think so too. A good manager.
I think it needs both. I think those two characters, whoever fills those roles, I think they work best together. I think you need a leader, that people will listen to and follow because they're charismatic, but that leader needs a good manager to properly execute their ideals.
Yeah,
and
that's
I
the problem.
I don't think you can have it.
The monarchical system, the monarchy, that you give too much power and too much responsibility to one person.
We need a good duo.
Yeah, because, I mean, you have to have a vision and a strategy, an overall strategy, but then you have to have the tactical day-to-day execution to get there. And I think that's a criticism of not just Jon Snow, but of Dany, too, is, you know, she has a bold vision, but her tactics aren't all that great sometimes. I want to switch a little bit and talk about some of the characters, the medieval characters that you think are directly informing some of the characters we see in the story. And I'm a big fan of Sansa, so I loved the video you guys did predicting that Sansa was following Elizabeth I's path. So I want to hear you talk about that a little bit and some of the others.
They're not necessarily from the medieval times characters. I thought about Elizabeth when I read about Sansa and her story, not in the middle of the read, but afterwards. It's difficult for me to say because I'm trying to only mana.
Refrain?
I'm trying to refrain. No, not from. Never mind.
Sorry.
I don't want to do a one-to-one comparison because comparison.
Yeah, and I think everyone's clear that these are just inspiring versus this is her path. Yeah.
And some of the characters, I think they're a mishmash, like in a few characters or a few individuals from history that came together, like Robert, King Robert. The first of his name, very remind me of Henry VIII, because in his demeanor and he's fat and he's like the ladies and he doesn't like to rule that much, and he likes war and all that stuff. But in terms of the timeline, is more like Edward IV, Edward IV, that was from the York family in the War of the Roses itself. And I see the Daenerys Targaryen is reminding me, not in her character itself, but in her role, something like a Genghis Khan fella, like uniting the tribes, horse people tribes, and leading them outside their territory to conquer and destroy. And Joffrey reminded me a lot of Caligula, or at least the popular image of Caligula, one of the Roman emperors that the famous story that he appointed his horse to be a consul. He was very, very crazy and stuff. And also he got something with Nero the emperor, and Henry VI also from War of the Roses, that was also a little bit mad and angry and all that stuff.
So you're putting forth a compelling rationale for getting rid of monarchy and all these people you're describing. And we've talked a lot about democracy. So what's the pathway in the world of Westeros to get there? I mean, do you envision any of the characters we know today coming up with the idea of democracy, or even coming up with, a triumvirate type of ruling scenario? Or is everybody still locked into the notion that there's one leader?
We have to remember that in the Middle Ages, our Middle Ages, democracy was an old idea, not a new idea. very old idea. And from the perspective of the intellectual back then, a very bad idea, because you give too much power to the masses. In ancient Greek, some of my professors told me you can translate the word demos, or democracy, as the riffraffs, like the poor people, like the masses, the asafsufa, we say, like the mob. You know, like so democracy is like the mob. Very negative way of saying democracy. I think democracy in Westeros is very far, but I see some kind of a trajectory, I think, or some kind of a theme that is a separation of power and some kind of a formation of institutions to hold back like one class or one person from holding too much power. And inside this institution, they act like in a more representative and with social mobility, like we have the maesters and the Night Watch.
They vote for their commander.
Yeah, they elect their commander based on merits. We like to think of the based on merits and not based on his blood. Like you can be a bastard and be like the commander of the Night Watch, and this in the faith as well. These institutions are part of Westeros as a realm, but are outside the Game of Thrones itself, between the houses.
The good of the realm.
They are working for the good of the realm. So I see this kind of institutions and ideas coming from this institution be incorporated inside the mechanics of ruling in Westeros, and in that sense, it's similar to what happened in the last 300-400 years, that the population grew, and you had to incorporate these new groups into society and share the power with them.
And the wildlings also, they are like democratic.
Yeah.
They're like a bit of an anarchy, but they're more democratic.
Go ahead.
You were comparing certain characters to life individuals. Do you think it might be based on anybody's life or even?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Tyrion.
Tyrion. I thought about Claudius, the Emperor Claudius. From Rome. He also got a TV show from the 70s, from the BBC, I, Claudius. Very good show. I really, really recommend it. And it reminded me of him in the way that he really wasn't ambitious. He didn't play the game. This Claudius fellow and Tyrion he didn't start the story as a player.
And get to the top.
He wasn't that ambitious, but he got power. Never mind why, but he got power, and this power was put on him, and from his sense of duty and the need to work for the common good, he became like a good emperor. And if you think about it, like in a sense of political philosophy, Plato, the philosopher, said that the good ruler is the one that doesn't want to rule. Like, we need to convince him to rule, because if he wants to rule, he will be a bad ruler, because his decision will be for his own good and not for the common good.
And also Claudius, like during his time, he wasn't respected, even though now we know he was effective in many ways as a ruler. So that's similar to Tyrion a little bit.
Hey, I have a different question. We were talking about the rise of institutions, right? So, the Night's Watch, we kind of understand how it works. And I totally agree with the wildlings. They have their own, it's almost like a council system, or they come to some consensus amongst themselves. So they're ruling themselves to some degree. But the one group that we don't really know that much about, and you guys just did a really interesting video about it, is the maesters, because we haven't gone inside the Citadel yet, although I think from some of the casting news, we might go there, and also where Sam Tarly was headed at the end of season 5. And there seems like an opportunity for the maesters to change their role, because my perception of them is the maester kind of decides what he wants his role to be. Maester Pycelle is at the top, and he wants to be a political puppet master. He also does know a lot about potions and science in the context of poisons and how herbs are used and stuff. Then you have Maester Qyburn, who's kind of a mad scientist. You have Maester Luwin, who is more of the historian teacher for the Starks, and I think he's also probably a counselor to the Starks. And then you have Maester Aemon, who's like a historian. He's also sort of the voice of reason. So talk a little bit about the maesters in the context of the story and where you think they might evolve.
The maesters are we are introduced to the maesters as like you said, like Maester Pycelle and Maester Luwin and Qyburn were introduced as individuals who play like as a tool, like a computer. You need something, you need to know something. You go to the computer, you go to Google, and you check it out. They will tell you. You need some potion. You will get it from them. You need to know what this king that did 2,000 years ago. You ask them, etc., etc. But towards the fifth book, like in the fourth book, in the Fist for Crows, you're starting to see them not as only as individual characters, but as a faction with ambitions of their own and with a certain way they look at society. And they have like ambition to create a world that will be better for them and better for their skills. Like we get a lot of hints that maybe, spoiler alert, maybe they were responsible for the disappearance of the dragons the last time around. Like 150 years ago, there are a lot of rumors maybe they were behind all that. And we have another maester that he wasn't in the show yet, Master Marin, that who said like, who do you think killed the dragons? Like some knight? No,
Sam.
He told it to Sam. We already reached the citadel. Spoiler, sorry. And he said like not what it wasn't some kind of a knight.
Really modern.
And so I see it as we see the maesters as like a tool, but if we fast forward time, like to today, we see the role of the maesters not only as a tool, but they are like in the core of governing today, like the specialists, the know-how,
Doctors,
the engineers, the teachers, the specialists. If you're a politician, even if you're playing the game, you need to have some kind of an education, and their values, be knowledgeable. Look at the reality as it is, not as you want it to be, and don't be superstitious and be very empirical. Their values that are left in the story, because like there are dragons and there is magic, their values in like the big process of history won, basically. So I see them, they are really as players now. They're not only as individual maesters, but they have ambition to create a world that will have no magic, basically. That is my my theory / wishful thinking.
So, but how does it happen, right? Because it doesn't seem like they have a critical mass right now. They seem to be a very small group of people, at least from the TV show. They're almost sort of like a monastery. I mean, I have the view that the Citadel's like a monastery, and they kind of look like monks in the way that they're dressed them. And Sam's going there. So are you thinking that Sam is going to be a radical new thinker in the Citadel, where he's going to say, look, you need to stop selling this idea that you wiped out the dragons, which it sounds like that's what you're alluding to, because I've seen them, or the White Walkers are a real threat. We need to go open up these old books and find out how to make Valyrian steel again, and that might be the way that they become relevant to the story.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how they will do it. What I do know, when I read something about the Middle Ages, I'm basically reading what so-called maesters have written about the society. So that's a lot of power. It's not a lot of power in the present. But look at from our histories, the Jews. Like we basically lost all the wars until the current century. We lost everything. We lost the first temple, the second temple, etc., etc. But we had a written document that we wrote. I say we with a quote unquote. But the ancient Jews wrote this document, this very powerful document, half historical or not really historical, but like with really powerful myth that in your culture, like the first settlers that came out of Mayflower, they called themselves Israelites. Yes. This is such a powerful document that a small, neglectable group created that resonated to thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years, especially in the Middle Ages. They took it very seriously in the Middle Ages.
I think in current American politics, it also resonates a lot.
So this is the power I'm talking about.
But there's an interesting tension there, right? Because it's the history as interpreted by whoever wrote it down. And
one writes.
When I read the World of Ice and Fire, the Histories book, they use a lot of examples that are supposedly the actual source text, and often you can tell by the tone in which they're written that it is an opinion that is actually being stated, where they'll talk about, those people do this and this. It's like, okay, so we're not completely objective, and that's why I'm curious. How do we make in the context of the story? Do you see there coming a point where everyone turns and says, "Tell us, maesters, tell us the answer," or is it or is it just Sam's going to come running in with the ingredients, or is it that Cersei is going to go back to Maester Pycelle? Say, look, I created a monster with Maester Qyburn, or that's where I'm, because I definitely agree with the idea that you have an institution, all these educational, fundamentally institutions that are what get the democracy to work, right? If the mob's uneducated and easily persuaded, then you have chaos. You don't have a just civil society. And it seems like the tradition in the Middle Ages was scholarship and studying the past. Is that really present in Game of Thrones, though? I mean, how much are they really relying on the maesters?
I think one way it could happen to your first question at the beginning of what you said right now. One way it could happen, maybe there was a battle, like the war, like the big battle between the ice and fire, could cause such devastating destruction that they will be, and magic will destroy them maybe in some way, that they will be left as an institution that has an ideology, a way of thinking, and they can point and say, okay, now after all this destruction, listen to us. We know how things work, and that could be a powerful thing to lift up a country from the ashes, to have like a new sense of purpose, maybe, and that reflects the period that comes right after the late Middle Ages, where the story takes place. That's like the early modern period. Those values started to take hold in the period that is right after the period where the story is set now. So this is why Itamar thought that maybe if this is the late Middle Ages, right after that starts the Enlightenment. So it could be like where the story is going, like a translation to this transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period.
The name Dark Ages was invented by these historians from the Renaissance. They looked at the period before and said it was dark. So they have this judgmental attitude towards a society that didn't give them the opportunity to be educated because they have a lot of censorship and stuff like that.
And we see it in the Maesters when Meister Lewin, when Meister Lewin tells Bran that the Valyrian link chain that he got from the Citadel is made to ensure that magic is always treated as a myth. So they feel slighted by superstitions that are real in this world.
So, in the context of real history, was there any catastrophic event like the climate change, the others? I mean, was it the plague? What was sort of the mechanism that sort of started that shift?
There were a couple. The War of the Roses was, in Britain at least, politically at least, it was like a really big earthquake. In terms of a lot of the nobility it perished, and new players came into being, and it started this unstable. Not that Britain was that stable before, but this unstable, like recurring civil wars up until the late 17th century, if I'm not mistaken. And every civil war is some kind of an earthquake. And of course, you have the plague. The big plague, the Black Plague that eradicated like a third of Europe or half of Europe. And if you're Eastern European back in the Middle Ages, or Muslim back in the Middle Ages, you had this alien force from the east, the Mongolians that came and destroyed, the Mongols that came and destroyed a lot of stuff. That every destruction later brought change, and in the long term, a big change.
So by the end of the story, that will have a conclusion, meaning White Walker threat will be mitigated, or the dragons. I know you guys have speculated that dragons are not going to last. So you think that's where the story is building? Is that we're going to handle those threats, and maybe we'll just see the kernel of what's coming next, but we won't actually see it established by the end of the show?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like we'll see like a hint of the new direction. Like, we'll see all this destruction because George R. R. Martin said that the ending would be bittersweet. So the bitter would be all the destruction and the deaths of many more of our beloved characters. But then there will be like new roots for something new, something better to begin, and that would be like the sweet part. But it probably won't. We probably won't see it play out in a significant way.
So I want to go to. We kind of need to wrap up, but I want to ask you a question. I think it was Christine's question. If you could talk to George R. R. Martin, what would you want to ask him?
I really would like to have a discussion with him about how he sees history. If he's an optimist or a pessimist towards history. Like you have the saying of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the moral arc of the universe is bending towards more justice. And I would like to say that the way I see history is like short-term pessimism but long-term optimism. And I would like to make a discussion with him because I think he's a very wise man, and I would like to hear his opinion. How do you see history is like this recurrent circle of bad things that happen to humanity, or there is some kind of a moral arc or a big arc toward more justice, and that's where I want to understand the story as well, like short-term pessimism towards a long-term optimism, bending the moral arc towards justice.
It's like 98% of the story is going to be very, very pessimistic with a lot of pain and grief, and maybe the last 2% of the story, okay, we have a new government now, so things will be better. Yay! That's it. The end.
And they all live happily ever after.
Yes.
Well, we need hope.
So the pessimistic view would be that all of this has happened before, and it will happen again, and it's just going to keep reiterating the same non-learning cycle. We just keep doing it over and over again.
Yeah, basically.
Well, I hope it doesn't happen like that in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, we
Well,
do.
I think Jesse has an opinion on that.
Well, I'm hoping. I am interested. The more I listen to you guys, I think back of in my youth, I really loved Isaac Asimov's Foundation series.
Yeah.
Because it was right. He decided to retell the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, right? And so the more you guys talk about this, the more I see the similarities of, because it's a show about, an empire falling and a society trying to help them steer themselves back. So a lot of the maesters. So am I off base, or do you guys kind of see, I don't know if you've read this series, but do you guys see similarities?
I've read the series. I really liked it, the Foundation. And yeah, I agree. I never thought about it until you just said, but there are a lot of similarities, yeah. And I think one of the characters also said something about, like, it needs to be bad before it will be better or something like
Yes.
that. Very
Yeah, very nice. Well, I just got to tell you, this has been a blast. I know Wendy's right. We need to cut off time, but I could just spend tons of time talking to you guys. This is fascinating.
Sorry for talking too much.
No, not at all.
I know we're going to talk a lot. We talk a lot. But I'm glad that we're ending on a note of, gelatos and Vespos are where we're going ultimately in the long arc of history if we follow the Roman Empire, which is okay with me. So I do want to thank you guys so much for talking with us, and hopefully we'll do it again because you're not stopping on bold predictions in your videos, which we really enjoy.
Absolutely.
So thanks so much.
I love the comedy in your show also. Keep that up.
Yeah, I do want to compliment you, and I said I got to do my fanboy thing. I love the blend of your throwing in the history but making it entertaining and having fun. And I'm just going to go on record. Your Hodor episode was genius. I know you got, in fact, when I met Christian at DragonCon, I was almost tempted to, you've got to go see this video, but I figured he didn't want to hear it. But, so, you guys, way to go.
I second that opinion. I liked the Hodor video as well.
Yeah, I loved it. I had no idea he was such a controversial character.
Yeah. We can talk about it maybe some other time. We would also like to give a lot of credit to our editor and the director. He's in charge of most of the funny bits that you see, because we were just talking a lot, and then he edits it and makes us look smarter and funnier by accident.
That's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, and hopefully we will talk again, maybe when Season 6 comes around.
It's a date. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
We love to get your feedback. Call us at 206-202-4182 or leave us a Skype voicemail to our Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV name. We have many ways to keep the discussion going on our blog. Drop by tuningintoscifitv.com and leave a comment. On the blog, you'll also find links to the forum discussions and other links to follow our Twitter and RSS feeds and find our Facebook account.